Go back. My name's Ryann Richardson, and I'm living a double life. Actually, no, that's not true at all. So they tell you that you should always start this thing with a good hook, and that sounded like such a good opening line. I was like, I'm just going to go with it. No, but in seriousness, for many years, I did live with a bit of a secret. Maybe even a big one. The secret was, well, I'm what you might call a beauty queen. For more than a decade, beauty pageants were my hobby. Actually, they were more like my sport. They were the sport that I took up when playing football with the boys was no longer a sustainable solution for me. Yeah, that's me, the one with my name written on my helmet. I can't figure out why, as if I was going to lose it off my head. Never mind. But nonetheless, in pageants, as with all the sports that I played before them, I poured my whole self into competition. And like the elite athlete that I was, I trained year in and year out. And for it, I was rewarded handsomely with scholarships that funded the bulk of my college education, with the communication skills that rest at the foundation of what ended up becoming just a rapidly ascending career, and with a network of wildly accomplished peers all around the country, many of whom I have the privilege of calling my friends. But all the while, I was building that rapidly ascending career and intentionally keeping a high wall between it and my pageant life. I did everything possible to try to keep my little hobby a complete secret from my professional community. When I competed for Miss Black America, I had to take a week off of work, and I told my colleagues that it was to spend much-needed time with the family. I lied. I got on a plane and flew halfway across the country to pursue a decade-long dream. And when I won Miss Black America, I reached just this highest of highs. I celebrated quietly. I mean, quietly the way only like a carb-deprived beauty queen can, so with like an extra large, extra cheese pizza in my lap, a bottle of champagne in one hand, the TV remote in the other, but quietly nonetheless. And the next Monday, I put my heels back up on the shelf, retired my makeup, and without any fanfare or fuss, I went back to my day job. At that point, I was a vice president of a $100 million global technology company. I was managing a team in 3 cities across 2 continents, and I just jumped back into business as usual and into an environment where I had every intention of never speaking of what I had just accomplished, which is strange, right? Because typically, when we earn notable accolades, we want to share that news. I mean, I remember earlier in that year when I had been named to a certain magazine's list of most influential Black executives in corporate America, I had to be convinced not to buy like framed copies of this magazine for everyone in my company. It was a thing. But this win was different. Don't get me wrong, it was big. It was the biggest. It was the culmination of 10 years of hard work, the product of my literal blood, sweat, and tears, and approximately 3.5 pounds of makeup. But I knew that this accomplishment also came with consequences. Consequences that I might suffer if folks who didn't know me, or didn't get me, or didn't yet understand the full extent of my capacities learned that I had competed in a beauty pageant. A beauty pageant. In fact, I was even concerned that some folks who did know me, who had praised my talents and had watched me excel at my craft, would suddenly start to doubt my capacities. Conventional wisdom had taught me that I had reason to fear that my life as a beauty queen could somehow compromise my position, my hard-earned position as a credible, respected, influential executive. I was well aware of that expectation that the woman who is as frivolous as to leverage her physical appearance for personal gain does so because she no doubt lacks certain intellectual gifts, right? And while I always knew that attitude was fundamentally wrong, I couldn't risk my credibility falling victim to it. That was the reason for the secrecy. That was my greatest fear. But of course, now as the new Miss Black America, that secret was going to be pretty hard to keep. Within 72 hours back at work, I'd been outed by a Google alert. And I had to learn to embrace this identity that for so long I regarded as a professional liability. And I can say now that I've certainly settled in to living in my truth, proudly and boldly. But that journey has not been without friction. In the last year, I've had my capacities and my intelligence questioned. I've had my credentials scrutinized and my basic value challenged in a way that I had never experienced in my career before I came out as a beauty queen. So many of my fears in this last year have been validated, but so has my strong belief that it's about time for us to rethink our understanding of what beauty really means, particularly for women. Now, before I get ahead of myself, and y'all start rolling your eyes, I'll let you know that this talk is not at all intended to be my defense of beauty pageants. I will concede to y'all and all of the internet that, like so many other competitive sports communities, the beauty pageant world is a totally bizarre alternate universe. Like, it's weird. I get it. This talk is also not about like the woes of being pretty, because that would be obnoxious. This talk isn't even about who our culture of patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism upholds as the standard bearers of beauty. I'd love to have that conversation, but it's a different one altogether. Instead, this conversation, this talk, is about challenging the fundamental idea that beauty is somehow inconsequential, that it lacks practical value, that its importance only exists in a vacuum devoid of more serious matters. This talk is about why it's time for us to cancel the notion that women are either beautiful or smart, that we're either consciously attractive or competent. Dare I say that we are sexy or respectable, that we cannot be all of the above, because beyond that concept being insulting and illogical and so easily debunked, it's also rooted in this kind of anti-feminism that has real and substantive impact on the quality of life for women. I'm not exaggerating when I say that to deprecate feminine beauty is an act of aggression. It is an intentional effort to encroach on our power. And here's what I mean. Power is the capacity of some persons to produce intended and foreseen effects on others. By the way, this is the part of the program where I geek out for a couple minutes, so sit tight, get comfortable. Dr. Dennis Wrong is credited with this definition of power. He was a Canadian sociologist, an author, professor emeritus at NYU, and a self-described democratic socialist before Bernie Sanders made that like all buzzwordy. It's cool. And he was one of a handful of mid-century scholars who were known collectively in academic communities as the New York intellectuals. And sadly, he passed away about a year ago, but I've been diving into what is probably his best-known book, entitled Power, Its Forms, Bases, and Uses, which is regarded as this great anatomy of the subject of power. And in it, Dr. Wrong asserts that there are 4 distinct forms of power: authority, force, manipulation, and persuasion. And authority is this really interesting, complex concept that he further breaks down into 5 other subcategories that I hope you'll read about in his book, because we're not talking about them today. But we are going to talk about these other 3 forms of power, these forms that are so ever present in our lives: force, manipulation, persuasion. We can probably all cite plenty of examples, both big and small, in our day-to-day lives and the world around us of what these look like. Whether it's that schoolyard bully who is just able to physically dwarf all the other kids on the playground, and then he uses his physical stature to either intimidate or physically harm other kids as a means of control. Or whether it is the strongman leaders of authoritarian governments that use violence and state-sanctioned persecution to squash dissent in their people. We can all recognize these exercises of force for power. And when we think of power through manipulation, that's where the intellect and the savvy of a con man like a Bernie Madoff, who's able to trick people into yielding their trust to him, is seen, or where great wealth or access allows those that hold it the ability to bend people to their will unwittingly, not even realizing they're ever being controlled, influenced. That's, think, 2016 election, Cambridge Analytica, $6 million, and unfettered access to all your Facebook data. That's power through manipulation. And then there's power through persuasion, this final form of power that is perhaps the most effective and certainly the most sustainable because it's inherently consensual. It doesn't rely on fear or violence or duplicity, all of which require this kind of ongoing cycle of optimization just to be effective. No, instead, power through persuasion, it's safe. It's unoffensive. It's unlikely to provoke manipulative or forceful counteraction, so there is this certain permanence to power that comes from persuasion. Now, I'd argue that the great importance of beauty being that quality or aggregate qualities in a person that gives pleasure to the senses or exalts the mind or spirit, the value in that is in our ability to use it as a tool for persuasion. Beauty does affect the way in which the world around us sees and perceives us and our positions. It's the reason that countless studies into everything from advertising to worker compensation to political science have all found that there is a positive correlation between the attractiveness of a person and our perceptions of their trustworthiness, of their credibility. Studies of US elections and European elections find that a candidate's aesthetic appeal does serve as an actual indicator of actual election outcomes, and that children are able to reliably predict the outcome of elections based solely on what politicians look like. So if beauty is able to so reliably dictate our perceptions of persuasiveness, of that great, sustainable, most effective power, then beauty is in and of itself a vehicle for power. Now, all forms of power rely on an imbalance, an unequal distribution of resources. We can't all access the same powers, and without that imbalance, there's no power to be leveraged, frankly. We can't all possess the strength or the reinforcements to take power by force. And oftentimes we see men, because of their physical size and stature, exploit that particular vehicle for power. We don't all have the intellect or the wealth that allow us that manipulative power, and while those assets may be more evenly balanced across genders, they are far from equal access assets. But nonetheless, we respect and reward physical strength. Genius is always celebrated. The pursuit of monetary riches is about American as apple pie. But something about beauty is different. Beauty, that vehicle for persuasive power, that's trivialized. That's degraded. And I spent a lot of time in the last year asking myself why. And it's not lost on me, and hopefully it's not lost on anyone in this room, that of all of those forms of power that rely on an unequal distribution of resources, that beauty is the single vehicle that is disproportionately afforded to, recognized in, and leveraged by women. So why again is beauty frivolous? Why, unlike physical strength or intellect or great wealth, do we, at least in women, regard beauty as a liability? Why are women forced to make a binary decision between either openly wielding the power of their feminine beauty or being otherwise respected as bright, as talented, as valuable? Beauty, as women, is our unique superpower. Yet we've been conditioned to believe that it lacks value, that we ought distance ourselves from it if we want to be taken seriously. And that's not an accident. Last time I checked, men aren't encouraged to abandon any vehicles for their power. That is a burden that lies squarely on our shoulders. And refusing, through social pressure, women the latitude to leverage all of the tools available to us, well, that robs us of influence. It creates divisions between us. It doesn't allow for us to see, to realize the full scope of our feminine power. So women, today, I'm going to leave you with a call to action. And that's to check your own hang-ups about beauty at the door. It's to be mindful of the ways in which you may actually feed into the very notions that are designed to disempower you. I'm going to challenge you instead to proudly own the inherent power of your unique beauty, to leverage it boldly and unapologetically whenever and however you see fit. I remind you that you are under no obligation to live as either or, but actually that you and I, we both have a responsibility to live as this and that, and to in turn model the full range and diversity of women's feminine power. It's on us, every one of us in this room, to give permission to the women and girls who will come behind us to be able to take up space as dynamic, complex, whole beings, not these one-dimensional tropes of what womanhood should be. Toni Morrison wrote, "If you want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down." Well, I'm here to let you know this is that shit. It's time for us to let go of these broken notions of what our beauty and power actually are. Women, mavericks. It's time to fly. Thank you.